It began at 4:12 a.m. on a cold October morning near the Polish-Ukrainian border when radar operators detected something they were never supposed to see. A single Russian drone, moving at barely 90 miles per hour, drifted off course and crossed into NATO territory. Minutes later, fragments from another drone were found 27 miles inside Romania. By sunrise, Poland reported an unprecedented wave of 20 Russian UAVs nearing its airspace. This was not a mistake. It was a signal, and a desperate one. Nearly 4 years into Russia's invasion, the Kremlin's strategy had fractured. A war meant to last 48 hours had consumed 1,400 days. A lightning operation meant to seize Kyiv had warped into an exhausting grind that neither side could escape. And somewhere inside Moscow, Vladimir Putin, the man who once claimed to control every variable, was now losing control of the clock itself. Russia had more troops, more artillery, more warheads, but none of it was delivering the victory he once promised. Western intelligence saw the pattern clearly. Accelerated strikes on Ukraine's energy grid, sudden hybrid attacks on NATO borders, and renewed nuclear rhetoric. Moves that looked less like confidence and more like a countdown. And then the unthinkable happened. As Russian missiles pushed Ukraine's power network to the brink of collapse, and as winter crept closer, analysts from London to Washington warned that Putin's strategy was no longer expanding, it was collapsing under its own weight. A former UK ambassador, Nigel Gould-Davis, argued that Putin was running out of time, trapped by the very war he engineered. But why now? Why the sudden acceleration after years of grinding attrition? And how much time does Russia really have left? To understand why Putin's timeline is tightening, the story must return to the earliest days of the invasion, February and March 2022, when the Kremlin believed Ukraine would collapse almost instantly. Russian advisors assured Putin that Kyiv would fall in 2 days. Propagandists boasted that Ukrainian resistance would melt by the end of the first week. The plan was simple: a rapid decapitation strike, a quick installation of a puppet government, and a victorious address to the Russian nation before spring even began. None of it happened. By March 2022, it was clear the war had shifted from a blitz to a battle of endurance. And that single shift opened the door for something Putin never wanted: external players shaping events just as much as Ukraine and Russia themselves. The collective West stepped in first. From January 24, 2022 through the following years, the United States and Europe combined to pledge 392.15 billion euros, roughly $450 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine. That number doesn't even include parallel aid from the UK, Canada, Japan, and other partners, also funneling billions into Kiev's defense. Suddenly, the war wasn't about Ukraine's inherent strength versus Russia's overwhelming arsenal. It became a global contest of resources, political will, and industrial capacity. Russia's dream of a swift triumph vanished, replaced by a sprawling conflict shaped by every major capital, from Washington to Berlin to Tokyo. To counter the West's support, Russia turned to its own network of partners: China, North Korea, and Iran. But what they provided exposed an uncomfortable truth: Russia could no longer fight the war alone. North Korea shipped artillery shells, Iran supplied drones, China offered dual-use components, and purchased more Russian oil. The issue wasn't what they gave, it was that Russia needed them at all. And this new dependency set off a chain reaction that corroded the foundations of Putin's long-term strategy. According to Nigel Gould-Davis, the war's trajectory has always depended on outside willingness to sustain the fight, and in the last 12 months, nearly every external trend has moved against Moscow. Western support solidified, European defense spending surged, Russia's own partners provided diminishing returns, and within Russia, the pressure began to mount. That is why, entering 2025, 3 critical developments merged into one strategic reality. Putin no longer controls the timeline. Events around him do. How did these 3 developments converge, and why do they now corner the Kremlin more than any battlefield setback ever could? The acceleration began quietly, almost imperceptibly, before erupting into full view by mid-2025. The first layer of escalation came from Moscow's misreading of Washington, a miscalculation that would reshape the war. For most of 2023 and 2024, Putin waited for one moment: Donald Trump's return to the White House. Kremlin insiders believed a second Trump presidency would fracture Western unity, curtail military aid to Kyiv, and give Russia enough space to grind Ukraine down. When Trump was inaugurated again, Putin expected a geopolitical gift. At first, it appeared he had one. Trump's early months in office were chaotic. A combustible White House meeting with President Zelensky in the first quarter of 2025 rattled Western allies. Soon after, the US suspended intelligence sharing with Ukraine and paused military assistance. By April, Trump publicly accused Ukraine of bearing responsibility for the war, remarks that Russian state TV replayed endlessly. Inside the Kremlin, optimism surged. Putin believed he had regained leverage over Washington. Advisors told him the United States was drifting away from Ukraine. Russian officials began hinting that time was finally swinging back in Moscow's favor. Then, everything changed. By the summer of 2025, Trump's calculus veered sharply. According to reporting from CNN in July, the US president had become frustrated after repeated false promises from Putin regarding ceasefire negotiations. Instead of rewarding Moscow, Trump began criticizing the Kremlin openly. He urged Russia to take real steps toward peace. He warned of consequences. And during a tense summit in Alaska, relations between the two leaders fractured again as Putin refused to commit to any genuine concessions. By October, the BBC reported a decisive shift. The US had begun redirecting pressure onto Russia itself, exploring sanctions and even signaling possible approval for Ukraine to receive Tomahawk missiles, the exact development Putin feared. The Kremlin's first major miscalculation had detonated. The expected opening from Washington had instead slammed shut. The second layer of escalation came from Europe, and it hit harder. In previous years, NATO had struggled to meet even the 2% GDP defense spending guideline, but Russia's invasion changed everything. By mid-2024, 23 NATO members were reaching or exceeding the threshold of 2%. Then came the shock. European nations signaled plans to move toward 5% of GDP for defense spending, a transformation so massive it shifted the strategic landscape. For Putin, this was catastrophic. Europe's collective economy is 10 times larger than Russia's. Even a fraction of that redirected toward military capability would dwarf anything Moscow could field. Analysts from the Tony Blair Institute explained that if Europe committed just 0.2% of its GDP to Ukraine, it would erase Russia's material advantages completely. Nigel Gould Davis went further, calling it a slow, onrushing tsunami of defense capability headed straight for Russia's borders. The Kremlin had expected Europe to tire. Instead, it awoke. The third layer of escalation formed from within Russia itself, a slow burn becoming a national strain. Sanctions tightened. Oil revenues fell. Russia's budget deficit ballooned to roughly $50 billion. According to DW, the Kremlin raised VAT from 20% to 22%, cutting public spending and funneling more resources into the war. Healthcare and education saw reductions. Civil servants complained of late payments. Businesses collapsed under embargo pressure. Among Russia's elites, the oligarchs, the regional power brokers, the technocrats, unease spread. These were the people Putin depended on to maintain his political equilibrium, and they were losing money. None of this sparked open revolt, but the atmosphere shifted. The future began looking worse than the present, and elites knew it. Putin did too. That is when the third layer fused into something visible: acceleration on the battlefield and beyond. Russian drone incursions into NATO airspace surged. Poland confronted a wave of 20 Russian drones in early September. Romania found drone debris deep inside its territory. The Independent reported these incidents were becoming a pattern, not isolated errors, but creeping hybrid warfare. Simultaneously, Russia intensified strikes against Ukraine's energy grid. On October 21st, the Kyiv Independent noted a spike in energy sector attacks as doubts emerged about US missile transfers. By November, The Guardian reported that Ukraine's generation capacity had been pushed to zero in some areas, plunging civilians into 16-hour blackouts. This was not strength, it was urgency. A fourth twist emerged in early November: nuclear rhetoric. When the Kyiv Independent quoted Russia's defense minister warning about U.S. nuclear modernization and calling for immediate preparations, analysts recognized the pattern. Russia talks about nuclear leverage when it feels cornered, not emboldened. Each escalation, drones, missiles, energy strikes, nuclear warnings, formed a clear picture. Putin was not preparing for a long war anymore. He was racing against a closing window. He needed results fast. He needed leverage. He needed a victory, any victory, before the three converging pressures fully trapped him: a failed US bet, a fortified Europe, and an economy eroding from within. And that is why the acceleration continues, because if Moscow slows down, its entire strategy could collapse before the world's eyes. The strategic impact of these converging pressures is enormous, and for the Kremlin, deeply destabilizing. Putin's entire theory of victory in Ukraine was built on three pillars: outlasting Western support, overwhelming Ukraine with Russia's larger resources, and keeping his own economy stable enough to sustain a prolonged war. By 2025, all three pillars were cracking at once. The first blow fell from Washington. Putin had expected President Trump's return to weaken Ukraine's lifeline. Instead, Trump's frustration with the Kremlin pushed the United States back into a firmer posture. The shift was profound. In earlier months, Trump's temporary suspension of intelligence sharing and military aid had looked like a turning point. Russian commanders believed the United States was stepping back. But after Putin repeatedly offered, then withdrew, vague promises of ceasefire negotiations, Trump hardened his position. According to CNN, he publicly rebuked Putin in July, signaling to both Moscow and Kyiv that Washington was unwilling to tolerate what it viewed as Russian manipulation. This reversal shattered a fundamental assumption in Moscow, that the United States would disengage. Instead, Trump moved toward punitive measures, including threats of renewed sanctions. He even floated the possibility of authorizing long-range Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine. The BBC reported in October that this represented a direct shift in leverage. Pressure that had once been directed at Kyiv was now aimed squarely at the Kremlin. For Putin, this was not just a diplomatic setback. It meant losing the one external actor he believed he could influence. Europe's transformation delivered the second, even more punishing blow. NATO members had long been criticized for low defense spending, with only 6 countries meeting the alliance's 2% GDP guideline before the war. But the invasion of Ukraine redefined threat perception across Europe. By mid-2024, according to the Atlantic Council, 23 NATO members had met or exceeded the threshold. Then came the unprecedented move toward 5% GDP spending, a surge that would produce more armored vehicles, artillery systems, missile defenses, and industrial output than Russia could ever match. The numbers tell the story. Europe's combined GDP is 10 times larger than Russia's. Even a fractional shift of European resources equals Russia's entire defense budget. The Tony Blair Institute calculated that 0.2% of Europe's GDP, if allocated to Ukraine, would be enough to close the financial gap and sustain Kyiv indefinitely. Nigel Gould Davis described this as a slow onrushing tsunami of capability. It meant Russia was no longer facing Ukraine alone. It was facing an entire continent with vastly superior industrial and financial strength. In response, Moscow leaned harder on its last remaining deterrent: nuclear weapons. Russia holds roughly 5,580 nuclear warheads, slightly more than the 5,225 held by the United States, according to the Arms Control Association. Only 2 European NATO nations, France and the UK, possess nuclear arsenals, totaling around 515 warheads. That vast gap was one of the few strategic cards Putin still believed he could play. But nuclear leverage works only if Russia appears strong and coherent. With its economy straining, its diplomatic position deteriorating, and its army stuck in a war of attrition, Russia's nuclear threats began sounding less like strategy and more like a warning flare. The third blow came from inside Russia. Economic pressure, once manageable, was now reshaping Russian society itself. In September, DW reported Russia's energy revenues had plunged, growth had stalled, and the country was facing a $50 billion budget deficit. Sanctions squeezed the industrial base, limiting access to critical components. Ukraine's targeted strikes on oil refineries further eroded the Kremlin's revenue streams. To compensate, the government raised the VAT rate from 20% to 22%, effectively shifting the financial burden onto ordinary citizens. This redistribution carried political risk. Healthcare budgets shrank, education funding fell, regional administrations complained of delayed subsidies, inflation hammered households, and as Gould Davis noted, Russia's elites, long considered a stabilizing force, began showing quiet signs of anxiety. They were losing wealth, influence, and predictability. A system built on financial loyalty was now under strain. Russia's demographic and economic base was not collapsing, but it was bending. The longer the war continued, the more painful the trade-offs became. Every ruble spent on the battlefield had to be taken from somewhere else. Every refinery strike reduced the state's ability to fund the next year of conflict. Into this pressure cooker came the battlefield consequences. Russia's intensified bombardment of Ukraine's energy grid resulted in near-total shutdowns. The Guardian reported that by early November, some regions had lost all generating capacity, forcing 16-hour blackouts and plunging millions into cold, dark homes. These strikes were part of a broader strategy to break Ukrainian resilience, but they also signaled that Russia needed rapid, visible results. In parallel, Russian drone incursions into Poland and Romania expanded the conflict's psychological reach. The Independent confirmed drone fragments were found deep inside Romanian territory, while Poland faced a coordinated wave of 20 Russian drones. Each incursion carried a clear message: Russia could reach beyond Ukraine's borders. But instead of intimidating NATO, these actions reinforced the alliance's resolve. Poland accelerated air defense deployments. Romania expanded its surveillance infrastructure. NATO condemned the incursions collectively. What was meant to divide the West instead unified it. Strategically, Putin was losing every front: diplomatic, economic, and military. And the implications were stark. Russia must accelerate, because time is no longer neutral. Every month that passes widens the gap between Russia's resources and what its opponents can mobilize. The war Putin believed he could stretch indefinitely had become the war he may no longer be able to sustain. On the global stage, the consequences of Russia's accelerating strategy ripple far beyond Ukraine's borders. What began as a regional invasion has evolved into a multi-layered geopolitical contest that now pulls in NATO, the European Union, China, North Korea, Iran, and the United States, each with competing doctrines, interests, and timelines. For NATO, Russia's hybrid incursions into Poland and Romania were not isolated events. They signaled a widening conflict zone, one that tested the alliance's red lines. When Poland reported 20 Russian drones approaching its airspace in early September, and Romania later found debris dozens of miles inside its territory, the incident triggered emergency consultations in Brussels. NATO commanders saw a pattern. Russia was probing defenses, testing reactions, and trying to project reach despite its attritional struggles in Ukraine. But instead of intimidating NATO, these actions unified it. European members accelerated air defense construction. Border surveillance expanded. Joint exercises multiplied. For the first time since the Cold War, NATO viewed Russia not as a distant deterrence challenge, but as an immediate and unpredictable actor, capable of crossing physical and political boundaries. The European Union responded with its own transformation. Energy diversification, once a long-term objective, became a necessity. Russian oil revenues had already collapsed due to sanctions and Ukraine's refinery strikes, and the EU's imports of Russian fossil fuels fell drastically. This weakened one of the Kremlin's strongest levers. At the same time, Europe's collective move toward 5% GDP defense spending reshaped the balance of industrial power. The continent began investing in artillery factories, drone production lines, and missile systems at a scale unseen in decades. Europe's emerging doctrine contrasted sharply with Russia's. While Moscow relied on massed infantry assaults, aging armor, and imported artillery shells, NATO embraced a doctrine built on precision, automation, and high-end aerospace capabilities. Cheap Russian drones were met with advanced electronic warfare, modern interceptors, and new layered air defenses. The West's shift signaled something clear. The era of hoping diplomacy would keep Russia contained was over. A deterrence model rooted in overwhelming technological and industrial superiority was taking its place. Meanwhile, China observed the war with ruthless calculation. Beijing's support for Moscow, primarily through purchasing discounted oil and supplying dual-use components, helped stabilize Russia's wartime economy. But China stopped short of providing military aid at a scale that would risk sanctions or undercut its global ambitions. For Beijing, Russia was a partner, but also a cautionary tale. The grinding war demonstrated the limits of conventional invasion, the unpredictability of national resistance, and the dangers of exposing military weaknesses on the world stage. In the Middle East, Iran deepened its drone cooperation with Russia, supplying UAVs and components that fueled some of Russia's cross-border strikes. Iran viewed the partnership as mutually beneficial. Russia gained cheap hardware, Tehran gained combat data, technological feedback, and international leverage. Yet, this cooperation also tightened Western scrutiny, setting Iran and Russia more firmly together on the geopolitical chessboard. North Korea's involvement added another layer. By transferring artillery shells and ammunition to Russia, Pyongyang gained diplomatic capital and economic concessions. This partnership symbolized the growing alignment among states isolated from Western systems, a loose bloc driven not by ideology but by necessity. Despite these shifting alliances, the most significant global player remained the United States. Under President Trump, Washington's posture fluctuated early in 2025, unsettling allies and energizing Russian strategists. But once Trump's frustration with Putin crystallized, American policy snapped back into focus. Intelligence sharing with Ukraine resumed. Diplomatic pressure increased. The possibility of authorizing Tomahawk missiles, a capability that could reach deep into Russian logistics hubs, was explicitly floated, shocking Moscow and energizing Kyiv. This recalibration carried enormous implications. The United States nearly matched Russia's nuclear arsenal, with 5,225 US warheads compared to Russia's 5,580. Nuclear parity meant Russia could not rely on its arsenal to intimidate Europe without considering American response. The strategic balance remained stable, but politically, Moscow faced a dilemma. Its strongest deterrent was neutralized by a rival power it could no longer influence. In terms of military doctrine, the war became a global case study. Russia's reliance on massed forces and old Soviet inventory contrasted with Ukraine's asymmetric approach. Drones, targeted strikes, decentralized command, and Western integration. The world watched as Ukraine used relatively inexpensive tools to neutralize or disable far more expensive Russian assets. This exposed a critical vulnerability in Russia's military model, one that other global powers took note of. Across Asian capitals, analysts debated whether Russia's struggles in Ukraine would embolden or restrain China in its own regional ambitions. Some believed Beijing would grow more cautious after witnessing Russia's stalled invasion. Others argued it would accelerate preparations before the West could expand its new defense industrial surge. The Middle East measured the war through energy markets. Every refinery strike echoed through global oil prices. Every sanctions package reshaped supply chains. Russia's economic distress reverberated from Europe to Asia, influencing trade patterns and investment flows. In the next 3 to 6 months, experts expect several possible outcomes. Ukraine may receive expanded Western support if Russia intensifies energy strikes. NATO's new 5% spending roadmap could formalize into binding commitments. China may quietly adjust its Russia policy depending on battlefield developments. And Russia's internal stability, especially among elites, could become more fragile as the economic strain deepens. The world is no longer observing the war from afar. It is entangled in its consequences, strategic, economic, and doctrinal. Every escalation by Russia triggers a cascade of international responses, tightening the circle around Moscow and narrowing its options. What happens next will shape not only Ukraine's fate, but the balance of global power for years to come. Russia's accelerated strategy has now pushed the war into its most volatile phase since 2022. A conflict once measured in territory and troop movements is now measured in time. The one resource Vladimir Putin can no longer manufacture, manipulate, or control. The pillars of his long-term approach have weakened all at once. The United States slipped from his influence, Europe mobilized its economic power on a scale Russia cannot match, and internal pressures in Russia turned a slow-burning strain into an unavoidable reality. What was once a calculated gamble has become a narrowing corridor. The dramatic surge in Russian drone incursions into NATO territory, the intensified attacks on Ukraine's energy network, and fresh rounds of nuclear signaling all point to the same conclusion. Moscow is searching for leverage. It needs a breakthrough, something fast, something disruptive, something that can fracture Western unity or shake Ukrainian resolve. Yet every move that was meant to instill fear has instead reinforced the opposite. NATO tightened its defenses. Europe doubled its spending. The United States recalibrated its approach. Instead of intimidating the world, Russia's actions exposed the urgency behind its decisions. The consequences inside Russia are equally stark. Economic pressure is shifting from an abstraction to a lived experience. Higher taxes, shrinking public services, and a $50 billion deficit that grows harder to hide. Elites once comfortable in their immunity now feel the squeeze. Ordinary Russians face new sacrifices, asking quietly, but increasingly urgently, where this war is leading, how much longer it will last, and what awaits them when it ends. And through it all, the battlefield remains a grinding test of Ukraine's resilience. Waves of strikes on its power grid push entire regions into darkness for 16 hours at a time, but the country continues to endure. Assistance from the West remains steady. Support mechanisms remain intact. And in the background, Europe prepares for something far larger. A generational shift in defense posture that will reshape the continent long after the final shot in Ukraine is fired. This is the paradox of Russia's acceleration. Every attempt to seize control of the timeline seems to tighten the limits around it. Every escalation narrows the path forward. Every move meant to force others into compromise does the opposite. It rallies them. So the questions now stand sharper than ever. Will Russia's intensified pressure campaign shift the war's momentum, or will it trigger even stronger resolve from Ukraine and its allies? Will Europe's emerging defense industrial surge fundamentally alter the balance of power not just in this conflict, but across the entire continent? And with internal strains growing, will Russia's elites continue to tolerate a war that now offers diminishing returns and rising risks? The world watches as each day of acceleration nudges the conflict closer to an inflection point, one that could define global security for a generation. For now, the window remains open, but as analysts warn, that window is closing, and closing fast. If you found this analysis valuable and want to follow the next phases of the conflict, from battlefield shifts to global pressure campaigns, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. What do you think happens next? And how long can Moscow keep racing against its